arrested in New York City happened to...
We're 16 weeks away from trial. I feel as good as we can feel, but I know most of the time they win.
Wow.
Which means everybody else loses.
Carlos was a national figure, major media leader.
It's the show everyone is talking about.
The Carlos Watson Show.
If you haven't met Carlos Watson,
Basically like family, for real.
agreed. You're already late for the party.
You keep wanting to go back for more and more and more.
Yeah. A lineup you won't see anywhere else.
I'm impressed by the people he invited on the show.
We're just hanging out. It's okay.
I can relate to that person.
But like, you're easy to talk to. It's been fun.
YouTube's fastest growing talk show.
This is not somebody, who you would anticipate ending up being with the police breaking into his home and putting him in handcuffs and pulling him out.
Federal prosecutors in New York have arrested OZY Media CEO Carlos Watson on fraud charges.
Watson facing now charges of conspiracy to commit securities fraud, wire fraud, and aggravated identity theft for his role in the impersonation of multiple media executives while in talks with investors.
Going to the courtroom, we were all prayerful. We knew that this was something that was super serious.
And in this case, it appears the judge, he wanted some of the truth, but not the whole truth. And he wanted nothing but the truth that would convict Carlos.
I felt like I was transported back in time, and I was watching them lynch Carlos Watson.
We also uncovered that the judge had hidden financial interest in so-called victims.
Typically, a judge is trying to get to the truth of the matter. However, in this case, the judge was absolutely against allowing any evidence in that could show that the defendant was innocent.
It's like such an abuse of power, and they were getting away with it.
I just feel a real injustice has been done, and I feel like I'm part of it.
My name is Beverly Watson. I'm a lawyer, entrepreneur, social justice consultant, and I'm also the youngest sister of Carlos Watson. OZY is and was a company that was providing new and the next. They were providing jobs for people of color in media, which there is not a lot of. It was providing new content. It was shining a light and providing a platform for entrepreneurs and leaders that maybe you didn't hear about, but you would.
Welcome to the OZY family. We're outside! What's poppin'? OZY Media is a multi-platform studio that delivers a diverse and millennial audience.
We could just get everybody together. We have family style.
OZY started with bold, colorful newsletters that discovered the new and the next before they were introduced to the world, like AOC, Trevor Noah, Dua Lipa, and 2017 OZY Genius Award recipient Amanda Gorman. Next up, we launched OZY Fest, a groundbreaking event that's redefining festivals. And I think our festivals are one of a kind. Some people call it Ted Beats Coachella. We just call it OZY Fest.
OZY Fest is the coolest thing I've ever seen.
We transformed into a TV studio with a slate of scripted, unscripted, and branded entertainment award-winning series.
OZY was brilliant because it was creating culture. Our government has reliably showed us that the only thing they are willing to uphold is destruction and mediocrity and the status quo. Carlos and OZY Media were the antithesis of that. They were bringing together multiple different perspectives and ideas. It was a multi-pronged, brilliant approach to creating community, to creating curiosity, to creating education and connection and learning. And it was powerful and inspiring.
We got to think about the context here of what's going on in the media industry. We've got a lot of turmoil. We've got new media companies like Vice and BuzzFeed. They're desperate to find ways to get their audience connected with content, but they struggle to find content that their audience members really engage with. They had big audiences, but they didn't have big ideas. Investors poured a lot of money into these companies and they expanded quickly, but they grew faster than they could actually generate revenue to support their growth. So they started to post really significant financial losses. We're talking like 7, 8-figure, 9-figure losses. That's a lot of money to be losing. BuzzFeed saw something special in OZY. And we know this because in 2019, BuzzFeed actually came to Carlos and made him offers to acquire OZY, right? BuzzFeed wanted what OZY had, and it wanted it so desperately that it was willing to buy OZY and put Carlos as the president of BuzzFeed and integrate OZY's team and content into the BuzzFeed content machine. Carlos, on the other hand, wasn't as impressed at what he saw when BuzzFeed opened up its books. He wasn't as impressed at where BuzzFeed was going, at what ideas it had for creating content, and so Carlos turned Jonah down. And he didn't turn Jonah down just once. When Carlos finally says no for the last time to BuzzFeed, in very short order, Ben Smith resigns. Ben Smith was the editor-in-chief of BuzzFeed News. I think it's fair to say that Ben Smith was not just Jonah's sidekick, but he was actually central to BuzzFeed's attempt to acquire OZY. I think Ben Smith felt like Carlos was a threat. Remember, Carlos, by coming in as president, would have leapfrogged over Ben Smith. That couldn't have felt good to be passed over like that. Ben Smith puts out a series of articles that accuse OZY of being a giant fraud. And those articles are calculated to drive a wedge between OZY and its, up to now, relatively loyal investor base, drive a wedge between OZY and its reader base, drive a wedge between the face of OZY, Carlos, and all of Carlos's relationships with celebrities, with upper echelon members of society. Ben Smith's words, in the form of his New York Times reporting, is what kickstarted the government's targeting of Carlos Watson in the first place.
One thing is clear. The New York Times reporter had a conflict of interest when he published the stories in the New York Times that spoke of the allegations that later became part of the indictment. I was able to see the cap table for BuzzFeed as part of my defense work. And so I was able to do my own calculations, and my own calculations suggested that he held, several $1 million worth of stock in BuzzFeed, which was a competitor to OZY and had attempted to acquire OZY unsuccessfully at the time he was publishing those stories.
This was rooted in jealousy. What he was doing, BuzzFeed wanted to do. They didn't have the sauce because they're not into bridging gaps. They're into clickbait. In my heart, what the case is about is that Carlos had the nerve to try to do what he was doing and didn't kowtow to forces that wanted to take his company or quote unquote buy it. Like the fact that he didn't yield to the pressure. It was a vision, a dream, the legacy of his family. And I think if Carlos was not Black, just frankly speaking, this would not be happening.
But then I think there's a time when he got angry, just really angry. Like, how is this happening? As he said, and I agree, he didn't get a salary for 5 years. He put his money, he put my money, he put my sister's. We put literally millions of dollars into OZY. If you're talking about fraud, what person who does fraud puts their own money into the company and didn't take it out? He had opportunity to take money out and he didn't. Why? Because he believed, and frankly still believes, in the power of what OZY can do. And so he believes it so much, and frankly, that's also about entrepreneuring while black. We have to do more than others.
Thing here is he was putting his own money into this business. He was putting his own time. He was often the last to get a paycheck when payroll went around. He often gave up paychecks in order for other people to get paid. So that to me is not behavior that's consistent with trying to fleece other people.
I mean, it feels like they basically said, if we can't buy you, we're going to destroy you. And that's what they did with drumming up these trumped up charges.
I'm scared, because the system has shown us so often that it's not built for us. I would be foolish not to be afraid, but we have to fight anyway.
And he says, I'm not going to do that. I didn't do anything wrong. Why should I close down OZY? And so he didn't. And he said, we're fighting. And I saw it. And this fight demands all of us. It just doesn't demand him. He can't do it on his own.
I'm Gary Ireland. I'm an attorney. I work a lot in equality and helping with discrimination cases. I do a lot of employment discrimination. And I've worked my entire career in civil rights and social justice, including working with the NAACP. And I was particularly disturbed with the case of Carlos Watson when I saw it in OZY Media and the attack on Black entrepreneurs, which I've seen throughout my career. I'm not a part of the trial team. I didn't know Carlos Watson before I stepped into the courtroom and met him. I read the thoughtful article in the Bay Street Banner, The Troubling Case of Carlos Watson, and then I attended some of the hearings. I attended some of the trial dates, and I was disturbed at what I saw in the courtroom and the behavior by everyone involved. Many of the observations that me and many others saw were not verbal. They were gestures, they were tone, they were inflection. They can't all come across on a court transcript. So that's why we need cameras in the courtroom, particularly in cases that involve civil rights actions. And I would include this as a civil rights action because we've been asking our church since the beginning that the Justice Department be investigated for why they chose a California resident, a California company, to prosecute in Brooklyn. Why?
So my name is David Robinson. I'm a professor at Duke University, and most of my research over the last 20 years or so has focused on venture capital, on entrepreneurship. But I was contacted by Carlos's attorney. They wanted someone who had expertise in startup financing, especially someone who understood kind of how racial differences in access to financing play out in various capital markets that are relevant for entrepreneurs raising money. I felt like the charges were unfounded, and part of the reason for that is if you look at the way startups are financed, it's very common for entrepreneurs to be optimistic, and that doesn't mean you're defrauding someone. The thing is that investors understand that. These are sophisticated investors who have put a great deal of time and resources into studying the business plan, kicking the tires, as it were. And I think when you look at the charges and you put them in the proper context, I think their merit falls away. You know, when you have a fraud allegation, someone's lost something. No one invested in the funding round that was in which the alleged fraud occurred. So it's hard to see who the victim is when no one lost anything.
He did not use his mother's last dying wish to manipulate and hurt people. He used it to propel people and uplift them.
How do we tell people about what we have here that is special? Sounds like now is the time. People do need something different.
It is all sacred this year.
I'm talking to a sacred woman.
Your chat with Carlos Mencia was so honest about cancel culture.
It was very difficult. There were, suicidal moments.
People need something to want to strive to be, and it doesn't live on like TikTok.
My name is Dr. Carolyn Watson. I'm a psychologist. I am an entrepreneur. I'm a sister to Carlos Watson. I actually worked with Carlos in 1996 to 2001. We opened up and ran a chain of college prep centers helping students first initially in the Bay Area, but then it expanded across California and then across the nation, helping students to go to college. So I've worked with Carlos. I know his work ethic. I know his excellence and his demeanor. I am very much a believer in Carlos's innocence. We felt very strong that we had a really good team, good lawyers. Professor Ron Sullivan at Harvard, Judge Shannon Friesen was with us, Janine Gilbert. And so we felt good. We felt confident that we were going to get a fair trial.
How optimistic are you guys about this case?
We're very optimistic. As in all criminal cases, for weeks or months in advance of trial, really only the government's theory and their allegations are out there. The public, the judge, other people just don't know all of the facts yet. When we lay out the facts of what actually happened, we're very optimistic that the jury will see very clearly that Carlos is not guilty of anything, and neither is OZY Media.
This is not how it went. The defense was prevented from laying out any facts from the beginning.
The judge was adamant that he would not allow certain text messages, certain emails, certain tangible evidence that could clearly exonerate Carlos of the charges. It really didn't make a whole lot of sense because typically judges are concerned with the truth. However, in this case, the judge did not want to admit any evidence that could have proved Carlos's innocence.
I can tell you what I saw and what I heard, and what I heard and saw was unjust, and we didn't see justice in that courtroom. What I observed, other people observed as well, and we all came to the same conclusion that the presumption was that Mr. Watson was guilty. That was the presumption by the prosecutors and the bench, and they were treated very disrespectfully, the defense counsel and Mr. Watson, and we didn't see how anyone could get a fair trial in front of a jury with what Mr. Watson was experiencing.
In the past 5 years, 90% of the people that were prosecuted by these three prosecutors were 90% were Black or brown people. In increasingly white Brooklyn, and also covers Long Island. Are you mean to tell me there's not white criminals in Brooklyn? So that is alarming.
My name is Frank Parlato, and I am an investigative reporter and an investigator of legal and social targeting of individuals. I've had a good deal of experience in righting some wrongs, and on both sides of the criminal justice equation, I have investigated and found people to be guilty of crimes, and I have investigated and found people to be wrongly convicted of crime. And I have been retained to investigate the prosecution and conviction of Susie Hahn, Samir Rao, Carlos Watson, and OZY Media. I have never met Carlos Watson. I am not retained by Carlos Watson or any of the defendants in the case. However, I absolutely want to investigate jurisdiction. Why is a California company being prosecuted in the Eastern District of New York on a series of financial conspiracy charges? I don't really know why that fell into the Eastern District of New York, except that I have observed that the Eastern District of New York doesn't seem to have the same respect for boundaries as most of the other 92 districts in the federal system. So these and many other things that occurred during the trial raise issues about the whole system. And also in this particular case, did we really get to justice? And was the nature of the trial conducted so that the full truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth emerged? My initial investigation leads me to believe it was not. One of the troubling parts of this case to me was the way that it was scheduled. It appeared to be a rush to do the trial at all costs. It had to begin in May. And the defense argues that it didn't have time to study and prepare for the case, a case with 2.5 million documents. Watson's attorneys were expected to get through all 2.5 million in less than a year. I think if you divide that, it would be a full-time job for about 10 lawyers. 1.5 million documents they had to pour through in 7 months. Instead of it being a steady 3-week trial, there was a personal schedule that the judge had to fulfill. It didn't just go day by day, Monday through Friday. It went sporadically over 8 weeks, which could have been done in 3, maybe 4 weeks.
He would say, come in for these days, these are the days, and then all of a sudden, the other days, I don't know what it was, maybe it was vacation hours, but this man was calling out all the time and were switching the schedule or last minute, like literally last minute. We would be there right in front of the courtroom, and then now you're telling people you're canceling.
I just have never seen anything like that, where we were at the mercy of the judge. First of all, it would be highly problematic if we were just coming from around the corner. But myself, I live in Alabama. The Watsons, they lived in California. They would fly in, and the insult and lack of regard was adding salt to a already gaping wound.
Several weeks of the trial were just one day or 1.5 days, right? Because Judge Eric Komittee's schedule had something else to do. I think he even went on vacation in the midst of our trial, which was horrendous for us. Even for our 3 witnesses, one of the witnesses, which came from out of the country, had to come 3 times in order to be heard. Another one had to come also 2 and 3 times. And so, I mean, he was making it really hard. Really hard.
It would have been more conducive, I think, for a fair trial if it had gone steadily day by day. Many of the breaks were timed to leave the jury off for a period of time with the last impression of the prosecutor's witness. They'd hear the prosecution's witness, then not hear any cross-examination until they came back. So they had days to have a last impression of the prosecution's desired narrative.
There are so many things about the trial that are infuriating, that were sick, that made me nauseous. One being even just how they selected the jury. You think that for a trial where someone's life is literally on the line, you want people that understand what it is to be an entrepreneur, that understand the complexity of investing. They systematically cut out people that would be great candidates for understanding the complexity of this case.
I think when Carlos went into that courtroom, he thought he was going to have a jury of his peers. Carlos is a lawyer. His sister is a lawyer. His father is very well educated in the law profession.
They chose 12 jurors, 7 white men, 0 black men. You're telling me that was a jury of my peers?
They made the defense use their chip for a white male police officer who had been charged with racial biasness toward black men, toward black
people, the defense looked up his background in social media, had like 12 complaints against him. And the magistrate didn't actually take that juror off. We had to use one of our preemptive challenges for that. And so even that jury selection process was a bit problematic.
And the problems didn't stop after jury selection was completed.
It seemed like there was a lot of impropriety going on, bias, improper jury instructions, financial impropriety by the judge in this matter. I mean, just so many issues and errors that it definitely seemed like there was a terrible miscarriage of justice and nobody's best interests were served in this matter.
My name's Carlisa. I was a juror on the Carlos Watson case. That was my first experience serving on this jury. I didn't know what to expect during the screening process. That was intense.
Scariest part of being in the courtroom was when the judge came and he into the room and everybody stood up and sit down in unison, and then he said the most powerful thing that I ever heard as a black man. He said, "Ladies and gentlemen, the United States of America versus Carlos Watson."
But it must have been an intriguing scene because on one side of the courtroom, the defense's side, you had distinguished, experienced attorneys, a Harvard professor, a man who's exonerated more wrongfully convicted people probably than anyone in the United States of America, Ron Sullivan. You had a former judge, and you had a former prosecutor. They're all representing Watson. Three, all rushed, of course, all rushed to this trial without proper time for due process. But they are, let's be candid, the color of their skin is a darker hue. And on the other side, and in America, these are things that are noticed. I wish they weren't. On the other side, we're young, bright-skinned, inexperienced, semi-competent, but with all the advantages in the world, the prosecutors.
The opening of the prosecution was mind-numbing. And then when we went to open, Carlos's lead attorney, the judge interrupted it. And I thought, isn't the opening supposed to be sacrosanct where like it doesn't get interrupted? And he asked him, well, how much longer will you be taking? And I was just shocked, right? And so that is like right out of the gate where it was clear, or should I say further clarity, that this was going to be a trial like none other.
My impression of the case is that the entirety of it was largely and almost entirely based on the co-conspirators who did plead guilty. They were considered cooperators, and they testified against Watson. Susie Hahn was the chief of staff for OZY Media, and Samir Rao was the chief financial officer for most of the time, and the chief operating officer for all of the time period that was covered as part of a conspiracy in this prosecution. And while it is clear that Rao committed crime after crime, and that Hahn assisted him in these crimes, what the trial was about, what the case is really about, was whether Watson had any participation in the crimes that Rao and Hahn admitted to committing. When Watson's attorney tried to cross-examine Samir Rao, who may truly be the real criminal and maybe the main criminal in this case, the judge, for some inexplicable reason, would not let Ron Sullivan, Watson's attorney impeach the witness in the traditional legal way. Now, impeachment is where you show a witness is potentially a liar at heart and lying in his testimony, and the judge declined to let Sullivan explore contradictory statements that Samir Rao made in writing. And it was very important because it turned the whole case around. Now, if he had allowed this impeachment, there would have been reasonable doubt, because Samir Rao admitted to his crimes and essentially said in confession letters that it was his idea, he did it, and he had mental issues. So that when he was first confronted by authorities and he knew the jig was up in his lying and scheming ways, he didn't implicate Watson. But over time, he's not a stupid man. I believe he recognized that the more he could divert this to Watson, the less time in prison he would spend. So he had a motive.
Samir and Susie talked about what they did, and first of all, as they talked about what they did, and many times the first FBI interviews, Samir said Carlos had no idea. And there was 3 confession letters. But were the other 2 confession letters allowed into evidence? No. They talked about falsifying 15 to 20 different contracts, which is wrong. You don't do that. They took shortcuts. No need to take shortcuts, including one contract that that Samir actually made up, but they were getting the real contract for Black women owned the conversation 2 days later. Why would you do that? In fact, it was so interesting to me that Samir actually said that he felt like he wasn't getting the credit that he deserved. And frankly, it sounded like he tried to blow up OZY on purpose.
How are they not going to allow 3 confession letters from their star witness where he admits that he's the one doing impersonation? How are they not going to allow those letters in? Or dozens of emails between their 2 star witnesses? Why are they not going to allow those emails in where they clearly are saying they are doing the wrong stuff, not me? You don't see my name anywhere on those emails or texts. And the emails between those guys that went back and forth, emails at 2 a.m. in the morning, 3 a.m. in the morning, 4 a.m. in the morning, they do not have Carlos Watson on there. The government didn't show you a single email or text where Carlos said, hey, make up some numbers. Hey, why don't you juice that a little bit more? What the emails they have is Carlos saying being thorough, triple count that. Why don't you bring in investment bankers to get it right? Why don't you get an audit firm to do that? Run this by the lawyers before you do that. But the government wants to pretend that Carlos Watson's out here as though he didn't have a board of directors, as though he didn't pay lawyers millions of dollars to make sure we were doing things legally, that he didn't hire 4 investment bankers to make sure that when you raise money, you do it properly. These are lies on top of lies.
There was a forensic expert or an accountant that was speaking to OZY Media's income during the trial. And when they were asked by the defense, did they review OZY's checks, they said no. And obviously checks are income. How were you able to testify before 12 people as an expert if you didn't look at one of the major portions of their income?
There were Slack messages between the co-conspirators, Samir and Susie, that talked about how they had done all these shenanigans, frankly, behind my brother's back without him knowing. And those messages were disallowed. It literally was piece after piece.
Did Watson know or didn't he? I think the case boils down to that. Now, evidence that would have indicated or suggested that Watson did not know might have created reasonable doubt. And if Watson did not know, he shouldn't have been convicted. My question is, why was evidence about that the two admittedly guilty criminals in this case, why was that excluded? So at the end of the day, what we have here is a question of mistrial and questions of innocence, questions of newly discovered information, and questions of severe judicial bias.
What I saw during this trial is that he who rules the process rules the outcome. And that's exactly what happened. The judge basically disallowed evidence that would exonerate my brother. He only allowed 3 of his 30 witnesses to testify, while they allowed at least 20 people from the prosecution side. It was shameful.
They say in a criminal case, if the defendant doesn't testify, the likelihood of him being acquitted is very small. And in this case, he came forward and he testified, and what happened was a series of interruptions. He never could be permitted to get into the flow of testimony necessary to explain his side of the story. In this case, the judge is alleged to have also made nonverbal cues, like nodding the head when Samir Rao would speak, and putting his hands on his head or doubling over when Watson made statements that the judge did not believe.
The judge actually would exclaim and say, "Relevance, relevance," and do a face palm against his head. And he looked so annoyed at the defense counsel.
And throughout much of the trial, the judge chastised Sullivan for not knowing where every one of the documents he hoped to use were in this cache of $2.5 million, which he wouldn't permit time to review. The judge telling Carlos's attorney that he's yelling. Carlos's attorney was not yelling. He just kept on saying, if you're going to yell like that, and he started raising his voice, even though Carlos's attorney was completely calm and in complete control.
His main thing, because of the temperament of the judge, was not to get into an argument with them. And that's where that was his focus, was to stay calm as much as he can, because he knows how difficult this guy can be. There's the stigmatism of us acting a certain way, people of color. We come in there, we're combative and argumentative, and he was trying to make sure that wasn't the case. Those stereotypes was actually what we saw from the prosecution team and the judge.
There was one point where the prosecution put up Carlos's mugshot by accident, and quote unquote accident. And I could see it, right? And I believe the jurors might have seen it, but like the fact that accident happened, it was just yet another example of the ways in which both the prosecution and the judge were trying to, what I'm gonna say, railroad.
The disrespect I and so many other people witnessed in that courtroom directed at defense counsel and Mr. Watson was unnecessary and what many viewed as racist. And had it been a white defendant, I've never seen anything like this in a courtroom.
There was one witness from Goldman Sachs who literally had this racist tweet or racist text that she wrote. She was talking about Samir Rao's impersonation call. And when she said, well, the voice sounded inhuman. It was an inhuman voice, maybe some machine. And then a little bit later, she said, there's no way that voice could belong to a white person. So inhuman could only belong to someone who's not white. black. And later said, oh, that must have been Carlos Watson's voice. And that was Samir who actually did that shenanigans. And the prosecution was allowed to ask her how she felt at that moment, what she was thinking, to go on and on. And when the defense counsel, Ron Sullivan, said, well, what does a white voice sound like? He was shut down by the judge to ask her any more questions, because in the judge's perspective, race and questions of race should not be included.
And the judge, Eric Komitee, said there can be no mention of race. He said you cannot bring race into this.
It's hard to believe that there's any other excuse besides race.
From the beginning to the very end, thus far, they have shown complete disdain for this black man. I think that's all they see him as. They see him as Kunta that they want to make into Toby.
We didn't see justice in that courtroom. What we saw was really the complaints I heard repeatedly were that the judge was acting as a fourth prosecutor.
There was so much of a clear, relationship between the prosecutors and the judge. It was almost like a mentorship, mentee-mentor relationship. I was like, are they related? Is that his stepson? There was this level of endearment, and also I'm guiding you through this. I'll show you how to do this right. No, you didn't ask the right question. No, you forgot to object. Let me step in.
It's usual for a prosecutor to raise his own or her own objections when there is an improper question based on relevance or competence, hearsay, etc. But in this case, and it is intriguing, I'm not saying it's unprecedented, but it is intriguing that on 36 occasions, the judge made his own objection and then sustained it.
When the evidence that looked like Carlos might be innocent was introduced, the judge himself raised his hand and said, in effect, objection, and then he turned to himself and said, sustained.
When Ron Sullivan challenged the judge on his raising his own objections sua sponte, just on the spot, without being prompted, and then sustaining them, he was working on behalf of the prosecution. The judge replied, well, as I recall, I raised my own objections and sustained them for both the prosecution and the defense. So I took a look at the transcript, and he interrupted the defense by objecting to their questions 32 times. He sustained and interrupted the prosecution 4 times.
Which, you have to admit, suggests, at the very least, that he wanted to make sure his pet prosecutors, didn't lose a big one, because this would be a career burner. If they lost the Watson case with all of its publicity,
it felt like it was a public lynching in broad daylight. That's what it felt like. It felt like you were watching it with the judge colluding with the prosecution. So acting as, actually, it was a white lawyer who had said, he's acting like a fourth prosecutor, right? He's acting like a lead prosecutor. He's sitting there objecting, and then he would feed them things. He would say, well, if you would say this or then that, then I would say that. That makes sense. Is that what you're saying? Right? Or you need a case law. Like I was on the board or something for this case right here. You should look that one up because that can help you right over here. I mean, he was feeding them. We had a bunch of lawyers that were inside on our side. We were just like, wow, that must be nice to have somebody, a judge, do your job for you, right? But he was doing it one-sidedly for the prosecution, not for the defense team, right? And it was continuous. It wasn't a one-time thing.
In a very unusual move, Attorney Friesen and Attorney Sullivan filed letters during the trial alleging that the judge was acting in a biased fashion. You rarely see a trial underway where the attorneys for the defendant publicly accuse the judge of bias. And they didn't just accuse him of bias, they said he was acting as a fourth prosecutor. They said he was coddling and favoring the young prosecutors who were pursuing the case. The judge allowed the prosecution to make inordinately long closing statement and uninterrupted statements for opening and closing, while he interrupted the opening statement and the closing statement of Watson. I'm told by two witnesses that the closing on the part of the prosecution was over 4 hours without one interruption. Judge Komitee clearly showed that he was rooting for the prosecutors. He was also a prosecutor for the United States Department of Justice. And so what he saw as he looked upon the prosecutors is he saw, in my opinion, he saw himself a few years ago.
He was a prosecutor himself beforehand and was appointed, a Trump-appointed judge about 5 years ago to be a federal judge. But he came from their office.
The trial was very impactful. I've never seen anything like it, and seeing what I was seeing, where the judge and the prosecution was clearly biased, and the comments were racist. And so I sat there barely able to contain myself as I heard what I heard and saw what I saw. It's pretty heartbreaking, not terribly surprising as a Black woman in America, but still shocking all the same.
I would have knots in my stomach every single day going there. And it was a very traumatizing, extremely traumatizing experience.
Extremely like, that's not even an exaggeration. It's extreme because this man's life is on the line. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people thought it was a joke.
I would literally come back home to my wife and, days of me being angry because of what I saw. You're offering a man 37 years of prison without properly letting him defend himself.
I'd written a letter, and several others have written letters to protest and just to say what we saw. They were not being fair.
In a courtroom, you're supposed to be deemed innocent before guilty. But literally, Carlos didn't have a chance to be seen as innocent.
In any trial, a person is supposed to be considered innocent until proven guilty. However, in this trial, because of the mistakes and errors and miscarriages of justice, there was really not a lot of opportunity for Carlos to be proven innocent at all.
Not only you're Black, but you're a Black man in America. And then in the process of you being a Black man, you have to also understand that justice is served a whole lot different.
On October 10th, 2024, Clarissa, one of the jurors in the trial, comes forward and wants to tell her story about her experience. It was later discovered that several of the jurors had already made up their mind about Carlos's guilt prior to really the trial being completed. They had already decided in their minds that Carlos was guilty.
Throughout the process, there was, those little things being said. Oh, he's guilty. Just little things that I have to let them know, okay, I can hear you. Or please don't. But they made their remarks. And I heard it.
We've already filed 2 very explosive post-trial motions. The first motion exposes how the judge gave incorrect jury instructions, making it illegally easy to convict Carlos and OZY. Specifically, the judge instructed that someone could be sent to jail for 20 years for misrepresentation, even if he had no intent to cause harm. And by the way, that's not the law.
The judge essentially instructed the jury that even without intent, Carlos could be found guilty for causing financial or property loss to OZY's investors. So this is a fundamental error because intent is one of the most fundamental elements of a case that the prosecution has to prove in order to convict a defendant beyond a reasonable doubt. The judge omitted the requirement for Carlos to have acted with intent. That in and of itself poisoned the entire jury and the entire trial.
Prosecutors tried to dismiss this lack of intent in the jury instructions as harmless error. Really? Harmless error? But thankfully, a juror stood up and has come forward to confirm otherwise.
He was looking at 20 years in prison. There's nothing harmless about that.
After, when we went into the to deliberate, our responsibility was to, basically to review our notes or go over whatever notes we had and come to some kind of conclusion. I guess it was a lot of arguing back and forth.
Clarissa says that on deliberation day, she expressed to the other members of the jury that the jury instructions were very confusing and she didn't really understand what she was supposed to be deciding on. And another one of the jury members was very belligerent. He was upset that she didn't want to vote guilty.
I thought he was innocent. That was my whole take on, all of the votes we took. That was what I thought. The conclusions they came to, I always ask other questions, but no one could really give me a good answer. All of them attacked me. I don't know how everyone could come to the same conclusion from the beginning. I mean, I had so many other questions, but everyone from the beginning, they thought he was guilty. It was one particular one. He wasn't the foreman, but he made himself, he took charge as if he was the foreman. And he screamed at me and say, "He's guilty. Can't you see that he's guilty?" And I was like, "No, I don't see what you see." He never admitted he was guilty. The Samir and the other young lady, her name was Susie, they admitted their guilt. And from my notes, I didn't see where the prosecution had proved their case.
It's very significant that she felt pressured to vote guilty, and she was the only holdout, and she felt like she was basically bullied into rendering a guilty verdict. All of that goes to impropriety and jury tampering, essentially.
It should be the jurors, right, that has the most power. But when you had a judge who was not correctly charging the jurors, and then when the jurors asked for information while deliberating, and he prevented certain information that they asked for.
And the jury is probably confused from being dismissed 5,000 times from what's on record and asking for records. They asked for records during the jury deliberation, and there was even a long sidebar on what they would allow them to present to them or not present to them. But a large percentage of what the jury requested for evidence was removed.
Going through the process, the number of rounds that we went, I always came up with innocent. And like I said, until I read the instructions again, and then I voted was based on the instructions that we received from the judge. That's how I came to my conclusion. I mean, I feel bad that I didn't stick to my conviction and just stay firm on the way I felt, or based on the evidence that I heard.
The legal system itself may be written to be fair. However, it's carried out by imperfect people. I think we all know, I think it's pretty much an accepted fact that it's not always accurate, and it's not always carried out in the most fair manner. And so this case is a prime example of how that can happen on so many different levels in so many different ways.
Just a short time ago, a federal jury in Brooklyn, New York, convicted Carlos Watson of all 3 counts in the indictment, which charged him with conspiracy to commit securities fraud, conspiracy to commit wire fraud, and aggravated identity theft. The jury also convicted OZY Media, Watson's company, of conspiracy to commit securities fraud and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. The jury found that Watson was a con man who lied to investors to get them to buy stock in OZY Media and to shower him with money to grow the company.
And ironically, the language that was expunged in the original press release for the indictment was essentially repeated by the U.S. attorney after the conviction.
This was a conviction from day one.
Carlos, after the jury verdict, was remanded to custody, and he spent 5 weeks in the Metropolitan Detention Center. This is Brooklyn's federal holding center for detainees. The vast majority of them are awaiting trial, which, however, by design or by accident, the Metropolitan Detention Center is one of the worst prisons in the United States. It's worse than most maximum security prisons.
A jail that one judge called barbaric, another judge called inhumane, where there are regular stabbings and murders, where there's maggots in the food, where there's no health care, where people scream all through the night, where a third of the prisoners are addicted to something called K2, which in this particular prison is kind of like prison crack. Not only was I surprised to be convicted, but I normally when someone who has never had any criminal history and is convicted of a white-collar, non-violent offense, you normally get a chance to go home and get yourself in order and what have you. That's true for Elizabeth Holmes. It's true for lots of other people right now. Senator Bob Menendez all got to go home right away. They obviously tried to put me in one of the most dangerous jails in the country. They knew what they were doing, and they kept raising my bail. They made me pay 3 times the bail that there. You don't even have to put real collateral. They made me put 85% collateral. They literally made people wire money, put up houses, put up their retirement accounts in order to do it. And they did it casually, like, who cares? They made me have 8 hearings. Normally you have 1 hearing. One of the U.S. Marshals said, "Carlos, I'm upset for you now." He said, like, while we've been bringing you back and forth in shackles, we have let out repeat child molesters. He said, we have given bail to people who have been convicted multiple times of child molesting. They're saying that you're more of a danger to the community than those people are.
The prosecution literally said, there's no amount of money that Carlos can put up that we think he should go out on bail. He needs to stay inside here.
Seems so punitive, and we're just going to do everything we can to make Carlos and his family suffer.
At the end of the day, there's a guy who makes the decision, look, enough is enough. He wires to the courthouse, I'm talking about miracles, $1 million. He's not Carlos's family. This is somebody who says, I know this guy, and he shouldn't be in jail. And so I'm going to take $1 million and wire it to the courthouse as a bond so we can get him out of jail. Now, how many people do you know has that testimony?
I know that I'm innocent, and I'm going to not be cowed, and I'm not going to be intimidated, and I'm not going to allow them to strip me of my First Amendment right and my larger moral right to say the truth. Look at the 20 formal complaints about Komitee from ministers, lawyers, doctors, therapists, rabbis, and you tell me whether this is just Carlos Watson saying it's wrong or whether maybe it's worth taking a second look.
I think that this is a moment where the gloves need to come off, because this judge has proved that he does not care about Carlos' life, not even for a second. And he's going to do the worst. He's going to try the worst.
In terms of his sentencing can come anywhere between 2 years and 37 years. The prosecutors want him to serve from 24 to 29 years. However, it's up to the judge, the very same judge who was accused of being the fourth prosecutor, to determine the sentence. And presuming he had a fair trial, and I'm almost confident he did not have a fair trial, but if all other things were equal, and if he were guilty of the crimes, other people who have done similar offenses have spent 5, 7 years in prison. People who have been convicted of defrauding 20 times as much money as is alleged in the Watson case have gotten sentences of 10, 12 years. The Department of Justice released some figures not long ago that show that the average murderer spent 17.5 years.
So I can't comment as to what the judge is going to do, but based on what I saw in the courtroom, I'm concerned. Well, fortunately, Mr. Watson has some of the best counsel in the United States. So from what I saw, there are appealable issues.
One of the most appalling aspects of this case was that the judge had financial ties to the victims in the matter. That is a clear conflict of interest. That's a cause for him to be reprimanded by the Judicial Association in his county.
We also uncovered that the judge had hidden financial interest in so-called victims, Goldman Sachs, Google, JP Morgan, and Live Nation, literally totaling millions of dollars through secretive hedge funds. Not only was there a conflict of interest because of his financial holdings, there were personal relationships that Judge Eric Komitee had with some of the leaders at Goldman Sachs that he personally acknowledged but never disclosed during the case. Why is that?
That is just such a glaring impropriety and really unheard of. Typically, one of the first things that happens when a judge has financial ties to a matter is that they're recused. That's step number one. Do not pass go, do not collect $200. So the fact that he not only proceeded in the matter, but actually carried out the entire case and gave improper jury instructions is just so astonishingly deficient.
The Court of Appeals ruled, recently that a judge should have recused himself for a $15,000 stake that his wife had through a Charles Schwab account in a company that came before the court. That $15,000 of a spouse's, Charles Schwab account was enough. We're talking about millions, tens of millions of dollars directly held by the judge himself, coming on the heels of having been one of the senior managers of the hedge fund in question. So how likely is it to overturn a wrongful conviction? It happens, but just like a federal criminal trial, it has to be overwhelming. You have to prove your innocence. And that's not easy to do. It's much easier to prove someone's guilty than to prove you're innocent. You almost need overwhelming, shocking, and startling evidence. But it does happen. And if there's ever a case that's ripe for it to happen, in my preliminary investigation, I'm led to believe that the case of Carlos Watson is such that there may be exoneration. I think my final word on this is that we need to investigate whether Watson is and was part of this conspiracy, or he was a designated fall guy, designated by the prosecutors under a technique of interrogation where they pressured Rao and Susie Han to save themselves years of prison by potentially fabricating Watson's role.
Our mindset, as I said before, we are absolutely appealing. We also recognize and believe this is greater than Carlos. This is horrible that it happened to him, but if this is happening to Carlos, right, a upstanding, amazing Black man, right, educated Black man, hardworking Black man, successful Black man, a Black man of excellence, right? If this is happening to him, how many other people is this happening to, right?
What's happening to Carlos, it's like it's happening to us, right? If they could do it to Carlos, you know, like this tremendous platform, literally, like, they could do it to anyone.
You see the minds of entrepreneurs happening in young Black people. But at the same time, then you have Carlos's case, who says, if you go too high, we got a problem with that. This is your limit, Negro. And so now they just put a cap on you.
The reality is that this happens all the time to lots of Black and brown people, and that's why we have something called mass incarceration.
Perhaps this thing is not what we would have hoped or dreamed, but our prayer has been that God will continue to use you in bigger and better things, and I believe that He's working in the situation. He didn't bring you this far to leave you or to leave us. And so there is a bigger plan. Pastor Herman said it. Your story is not finished. And my prayer is that God will give all of us the strength to continue to walk and to live His plan and to be the voice to bring justice and grace and mercy and a more humane criminal justice system. So thank you for your courage. I'm proud of you for speaking up, not just on behalf of yourself, but on behalf of so many Black and brown people who this happens to and don't have the resources.
Carlos was so instrumental in empowering so many others, and I hope that he gets that opportunity again because he does so much good. And I hope that the judge would consider all of the good that Carlos has done within his life, mentoring and teaching youth, at-risk youth particularly, and the other many projects he's been working on. And he should be working on those again.
Carlos was a national figure, major media leader, extraordinarily successful Ivy League college graduate, just amazing trajectory in the terms of the impact he was already having, the impact he was poised to have. You're not going to find a better person, than Carlos was. It would just be crazy to see a person of his stature, just taken out of this world, and extracted from, our lives and put into any type of prison, abandoned, not free.
My prayer is that he keep the faith and that he knows that his mom is obviously with him every step, every breath of the way, that the truth and the spirit and the love that was so clearly part of the spirit of OZY, that cannot be killed.
My wish for Carlos is that he's reunited with his family, because he's done so much to keep families together. He's done so much to make sure that families succeed. He's done so much to make sure that we as a community are able to enjoy certain accesses and privileges that are not usually afforded to us. And I would encourage everybody else that's watching this, everybody else that's heard about Carlos, everybody else that has participated in Carlos's events, just as he gave you the opportunity to be there with him, come on this side and see if you can be there for him. Because this is an excellent man.
I'm here because, I don't know what I can do in terms of the situation, but in terms of me, I think it's the right thing to do because that's the way I felt. And I wish I had stayed strong in my conviction to this day, as I feel that he's innocent. He's not guilty.
Our family is a family of faith. We trust God. We believe God. We are praying for some explosive truth.
I need my brother. I love my brother. I believe in my brother because I have seen my brother. He's an amazing, kind, generous, hard-willed, hard-working person. He's not perfect. No one's perfect. He deserves to have a fair trial. And we need him here.